The surgical ward at Memorial Veterans Hospital fell into complete silence as Rose Jean Martinez hit the floor with a sickening crack. Her medical clipboard scattered across the polished linoleum, patient charts flying in every direction like white confetti marking her humiliation. Dr. Bradley Henderson stood over her, his expensive leather shoe deliberately planted on her stethoscope, grinding it into the floor with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his perfect victim. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Already on your knees where you belong? His voice carried across the busy hallway, drawing the attention of nurses, orderlies, and visiting families. Every head turned to witness the spectacle he was orchestrating. Rose Zhang didn't make a sound, didn't protest. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, gathering the scattered papers, as if this kind of cruelty was just another part of her daily routine. A cluster of medical residents gathered around Henderson, their phones subtly recording what they assumed would be entertaining footage for their social media feeds. This was the moment that would define everything that followed, though none of them understood the significance of what they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henderson announced, spreading his arms wide like a ringmaster introducing the main act. "Behold the future of military medicine. Soft, silent, and completely useless when pressure mounts." The laughter that erupted from his audience was sharp and cruel, echoing off the hospital walls like gunshots. Rose Zhang continued collecting her papers, her movements deliberate and practiced. But something caught the fluorescent light as she bent forward. A small, worn pendant hanging from a chain around her neck, partially hidden beneath her scrubs. The metal was tarnished with age, and etched into its surface were 3 small crosses, so faded they were barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Dr. Margaret Thompson paused at the nursing station, her experienced eyes catching that glimpse of metal against Rose Jean's chest. Something about those symbols triggered a memory from her own military service, something that made her stomach tighten with recognition. But Rose Zhang moved too quickly, tucking the pendant back beneath her uniform before anyone else could see it clearly. The confrontation had started 3 weeks earlier in Henderson's office, a sterile space decorated with diplomas and awards that spoke more to ambition than actual service. Rose Zhang had been summoned there under the pretense of a routine performance review, but Henderson's agenda was far more personal and vindictive. "Martinez," he'd said without looking up from her file, "I've been reviewing your background, and frankly, I'm concerned about your qualifications for this position." His tone carried the kind of dismissive authority that made it clear this wasn't a discussion, but a verdict already reached. Rose Zhang had stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that seemed almost military in its precision. "Is there something specific about my work that concerns you, Dr. Henderson?" "Your work?" Henderson had laughed, finally lifting his eyes to study her with undisguised contempt. "You call what you do work? You're quiet to the point of being invisible. You avoid taking leadership on critical cases, and frankly, I question whether someone with your background has what it takes to handle the pressures of emergency medicine." The pause before background was deliberate, loaded with implications that Rose Zhang understood perfectly. Henderson had done his research, or thought he had. What he'd found was a resume with carefully constructed gaps, medical credentials that seemed almost too perfect, and recommendations that were enthusiastic but strangely vague about specifics. "I've served in various medical capacities," Rose Zhang had replied simply, offering no elaboration that might satisfy his curiosity or feed his suspicions. "Various medical capacities," Henderson had repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "How wonderfully non-specific. Tell me, Martinez, have you ever actually been in a real emergency situation? Something that required actual courage, actual decision-making under pressure?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Rose Jean's fingers had moved unconsciously to her chest, touching the hidden pendant through her scrubs in a gesture so brief that Henderson missed its significance entirely. "I've been in situations that required medical intervention," she'd answered, her voice remaining steady despite the provocation. Henderson had leaned back in his leather chair, satisfied that he'd identified what he saw as weakness masquerading as competence. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." Vague non-answers, deflection, inability to demonstrate real experience. "This is a military hospital, Martinez. We deal with combat veterans, traumatic injuries, life and death situations that require strength and decisiveness." He'd stood up. Then, moving around his desk to loom over her in a calculated display of intimidation. "I'm not convinced you have what it takes. In fact, I'm beginning to think your presence here might be detrimental to patient care and unit morale." Rose Zhang had absorbed his words without visible reaction, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing became more controlled and deliberate. These were signs of someone managing stress through techniques learned in circumstances far more dangerous than a hospital office. "I understand your concerns," she said finally. "Is there anything specific you'd like me to do differently?" The reasonableness of her response had only seemed to irritate Henderson further. He'd been expecting defensiveness, arguments, some kind of emotional reaction that would justify the campaign he was planning to wage against her. Instead, he was faced with professional composure that made his aggression look petty by comparison. "What I'd like," he'd said, his voice growing colder, "is for you to prove that you belong here. Really prove it. Not with words or credentials, but with actions that demonstrate you can handle the kind of pressure that breaks weak people." That had been the beginning of what Henderson thought of as his educational campaign, designed to expose Rose Jean's limitations and ultimately force her resignation. What he didn't realize was that every challenge he devised, every humiliation he orchestrated, was being absorbed by someone whose definition of pressure had been forged in circumstances he couldn't begin to imagine. The daily harassment began with small, calculated cruelties. Rose Zhang would arrive at work to find her assignments changed without notice, forcing her to scramble to catch up on cases she hadn't been briefed about. Her medical supplies would mysteriously go missing, requiring her to spend precious time tracking down equipment while patients waited. Henderson would schedule important meetings during her shifts and then criticize her for not attending, creating a paper trail of supposed deficiencies. But Rose Zhang adapted to each new challenge with the kind of fluid resilience that spoke to extensive experience in hostile environments. When her supplies disappeared, she began maintaining her own carefully organized kit, always prepared for any medical emergency. When her assignments changed, she arrived early to review every patient file, ensuring she was ready for whatever the day might bring. The other nurses watched this systematic persecution with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Sarah Chun, a veteran nurse who'd worked at Memorial for 8 years, found herself increasingly angry at what she was witnessing. "This is insane," she told her colleague Maria Santos during a brief break between shifts. "Rose is one of the best nurses we have. Yesterday she diagnosed that veteran's internal bleeding when the attending physician missed it completely. Now Henderson has her doing inventory in the supply closet." Maria nodded grimly, having witnessed too many of Henderson's campaigns against staff members who somehow threatened his ego. "He's done this before. Remember Jennifer Walsh? Excellent trauma nurse, but she questioned one of his treatment decisions in front of residents. He made her life so miserable she transferred to pediatrics just to escape him. But why Rose?" Sarah asked, genuinely puzzled. "She never challenges him, never speaks up in meetings, never does anything that could be seen as threatening his authority." "That's exactly why," Maria replied with the wisdom of someone who'd observed hospital politics for over a decade. "Henderson can't stand competence he can't control. Rose makes him look bad just by doing her job well, and she does it so quietly that he can't find legitimate reasons to criticize her work. What neither Sarah nor Maria understood was that Rose Jean's quiet competence wasn't just the result of good training or natural talent. Every movement she made, every decision she took, every crisis she managed was informed by experiences that would have broken most people. The pendant she wore wasn't just jewelry, and the 3 crosses etched into its surface weren't religious symbols. They were something far more specific, far more significant, and far more dangerous to Henderson's campaign than he could possibly realize. The escalation came during a particularly busy evening shift, when the emergency department was overwhelmed with casualties from a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate. Ambulances arrived in rapid succession, bringing patients with injuries ranging from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. The entire medical staff was stretched to their limits, working with the kind of focused intensity that separated competent professionals from those who cracked under pressure. Rose Jean moved through the chaos with preternatural calm, her hands steady as she triaged patients, started IVs, and assisted with emergency procedures. She seemed to anticipate complications before they arose, positioning herself exactly where she was needed most, communicating essential information with an economy of words that maximized efficiency. Henderson watched her performance with growing irritation. Every time he expected her to falter, she adapted. Every crisis he hoped would expose her limitations, instead showcased abilities that made his own management style look chaotic by comparison. The final straw came when she quietly corrected a medication dosage he'd ordered, preventing what could have been a serious adverse reaction. "Martinez," he'd snapped, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. "Did you just countermand my direct order?" Rose Jean had looked up from the patient she was treating, her expression calm despite the storm she could see building in Henderson's eyes. "I suggested an adjustment to the dosage based on the patient's weight and medical history. The amount you ordered could cause complications." "Could it cause complications?" Henderson's voice rose to a level that made other staff members glance over nervously. "And exactly what qualifies you to make that determination? Last I checked, you're a nurse, not a physician. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The emergency department fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors and the quiet whir of ventilators. Everyone understood they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond this moment. "I'm qualified to recognize when a patient's safety might be at risk," Rose Jean had replied, her voice remaining level despite the public nature of the confrontation. Henderson had stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Your job is to follow orders, not to think. If I wanted your medical opinion, I would have asked for it. Is that clear?" Rose Jean had nodded slightly, but there was something in her eyes that Henderson mistook for submission. What he was actually seeing was the kind of controlled restraint that came from extensive training in situations where the wrong reaction could get people killed. "Good," Henderson had continued, satisfied that he'd made his point in front of the entire staff. "Now perhaps you can do your actual job and let the real medical professionals handle the thinking." But as he'd turned away, confident in his victory, Rose Jean had quietly administered the correct dosage anyway. The patient's vitals stabilized immediately, and what could have been a medical emergency was averted by her quick thinking and courage to act despite the consequences she knew would follow. Henderson discovered her insubordination an hour later when he reviewed the patient's chart. His rage was immediate and volcanic, leading to the confrontation in the hallway that had brought them to this moment of public humiliation. Now, as Rose Jean gathered the last of her scattered papers from the hospital floor, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching her. Some carried pity, some embarrassment at witnessing such cruelty, and a few carried something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps. or the beginning of questions that Henderson would soon wish had never been asked. Dr. Thompson's hand tightened on her coffee cup as she watched the scene unfold. Something about Rose Jean's composure under attack, something about the way she moved and carried herself, was triggering memories from her own military service. The pendant she'd glimpsed, those 3 small crosses, looked familiar in a way that made her stomach clench with growing certainty. After the crowd dispersed and Henderson strutted away satisfied with his performance, Dr. Thompson approached. "Rose Jean at the nursing station. Are you all right?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying genuine concern. Rose Jean looked up from organizing her recovered paperwork, her expression as composed as always. "I'm fine, Dr. Thompson. Thank you for asking." But Thompson wasn't satisfied with the deflection. "Rose, can I ask you something? That pendant you wear, the one with the 3 crosses, where did you get it?" Rose Jean's hand moved instinctively to her chest, covering the hidden pendant through her scrubs. For just a moment, her careful composure cracked, revealing something that looked like carefully controlled pain. "It was a gift," she said simply, but Thompson caught the weight in those 3 words. "From someone in the service?" Rose Jean was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the outline of the pendant through her uniform. "From someone who understood what it meant to carry people home." The phrase hit Thompson like a physical blow. She'd heard those exact words before, spoken by a legendary medic whose story had become something between fact and myth in certain military circles. A medic who'd done something so extraordinary, so impossible, that it had been classified at the highest levels to protect operational security. "Rose," Thompson said carefully, "I think we need to talk." Rose Jean Martinez lived in apartment 312 of Willowbrook Gardens, a modest complex 15 minutes from Memorial Veterans Hospital. The building housed mostly hospital staff, veterans on disability, and young families trying to make ends meet. In an expensive city, her 1-bedroom unit was spartanly furnished, everything arranged with the kind of precise functionality that spoke to someone who valued efficiency over comfort. Each morning, at exactly 0530 hours, Rose Jean's internal clock woke her before any alarm. The habit had been forged years ago in places where oversleeping meant missing critical intelligence briefings or medical transport schedules. She never needed the backup alarm she set, but she kept the routine anyway, unwilling to trust that civilian life had completely retrained her survival instincts. Her morning ritual began with exactly 8 minutes of stretching exercises, movements that looked like yoga to casual observers, but were actually tactical flexibility drills designed to maintain the kind of physical readiness that could mean the difference between life and death in hostile territory. She performed them in front of her bedroom window, which offered a clear view of all 3 entrances to the apartment complex. Old habits died hard, and situational awareness remained as automatic as breathing. The pendant never left her neck, not even during her morning shower. The hot water would make the metal warm against her skin, and she'd trace the 3 crosses with her fingertip while the steam clouded the bathroom mirror. Each cross represented something specific, something she carried with her every day but never spoke about to anyone in her civilian life. The first cross for courage under fire, the second for sacrifice without recognition, the third for promises that transcended death itself. Her coffee was always black, no sugar, no cream. Not because she preferred it that way, but because in the forward operating bases where she'd learned to depend on caffeine for survival, such luxuries were rarely available. Miri coffee with lukewarm water from a canteen had trained her palate to accept function over pleasure, and she'd never bothered to retrain it for civilian comforts. The drive to work took her past Memorial Park, where she sometimes spotted other early morning joggers following the winding paths between oak trees and memorial benches. She'd tried jogging there once, but something about the open spaces and multiple sight lines had made her deeply uncomfortable. Instead, she preferred the controlled environment of her apartment complex's small gym, where she could see every entrance and exit while maintaining her cardiovascular fitness. Rose Zhang kept exactly $317 in cash hidden in various locations throughout her apartment. Not because she distrusted banks, but because experience had taught her that electronic transactions could be tracked, accounts could be frozen, and sometimes disappearing quickly meant the difference between safety and capture. The specific amount wasn't random. It represented bus fare to 3 different cities, plus food and lodging for 72 hours in each location. Her medical bag was always packed and ready by the door, equipped with supplies that went far beyond what most nurses carried. Hemostatic agents for controlling severe bleeding, pressure bandages designed for battlefield wounds, and antibiotics that were typically reserved for military use. To anyone who looked closely, it was clear this wasn't a standard civilian medical kit, but most people never looked closely enough to notice the difference. At the hospital, Rose Jean's colleagues saw her as the nurse who took the difficult shifts nobody else wanted. Night duty when the emergency department dealt with drug overdoses and domestic violence cases. Holiday weekends when trauma from car accidents and alcohol-related incidents kept the staff running at maximum capacity. She never complained about these assignments, never asked for preferred scheduling, never seemed to tire despite working more hours than almost anyone else on staff. What they didn't notice was how she positioned herself during shift changes, always where she could observe all the main corridors and exits. How she memorized the layouts of every floor, including service areas and emergency stairwells that most staff never used. How she kept track of which security guards were on duty and when they made their rounds, information that seemed irrelevant to a nurse but was second nature to someone whose survival had once depended on knowing exactly who was where at any given moment. Dr. Linda Rodriguez, who supervised the night shift emergency department, had worked with Rose Zhang for 2 years, without ever learning anything significant about her personal life. "She's incredibly competent," Rodriguez would tell anyone who asked about her. "Never loses her cool, never makes mistakes, always knows exactly what to do in a crisis. But she's like a ghost. Shows up, does exceptional work, disappears until the next shift." The ghost comparison was more accurate than Rodriguez realized. Rose Zhang had spent years learning to move through dangerous environments without drawing attention, to blend into backgrounds while maintaining constant vigilance, to be present without being noticeable. These skills had kept her alive in places where standing out meant becoming a target, and she'd never fully abandoned them despite the safety of civilian life. Her apartment told the story of someone who lived ready to leave at a moment's notice. No photographs on the walls, nothing that couldn't be abandoned without regret. Her clothes were practical, durable, chosen for function rather than fashion. Her furniture was the kind that came with the apartment, and she'd added nothing that would be difficult to transport quickly, but hidden in her bedroom closet, behind winter coats she rarely needed in the mild climate, was a footlocker that told a different story entirely. Inside, wrapped in waterproof material, were items that spoke to a past she kept carefully separated from her present life. A field medical manual with pages marked by sand and stained with substances that could have been blood or iodine. Photographs of places that didn't appear on tourist maps, desert landscapes marked by the kind of destruction that only came from prolonged conflict. Among these items was a letter, creased from repeated folding and unfolding, written on military letterhead in a handwriting that was clearly struggling against pain or exhaustion. The letter was addressed to Angel, and its contents spoke of gratitude for impossible rescues, of lives saved against overwhelming odds, of a debt that could never be repaid. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, but the rank insignia was clear. Lieutenant Colonel Rose Zhang read this letter exactly once per month, always on the anniversary of a date that meant nothing to her civilian colleagues but everything to her sense of identity. She'd unfold it carefully, trace the words with her fingertip, and then pack it away again until the next month's remembrance. It was her only remaining connection to a time when her skills had been pushed to their absolute limits, when the difference between success and failure was measured in lives rather than patient satisfaction scores. The pendant she wore had been a gift from one of the 3 soldiers whose names she carried with her always: Sergeant Michael Williams, Corporal Jennifer Thompson, and Private Daniel Rodriguez. Not the same Thompson as Dr. Margaret Thompson, though the coincidence had given Rose Jane pause when she'd first heard the name during her hospital orientation. These 3 soldiers had given her the pendant before what they'd all known might be their final mission together, and it had become her most treasured possession not because of its monetary value, but because of what it represented. Each morning, as she prepared for work, Rose Jeanne would touch the pendant and recite 3 names, silently. Not the names of the soldiers who'd given it to her, but the names of the soldiers she'd carried through a minefield and circumstances that had earned her decorations she'd never claimed and recognition she'd specifically requested be kept classified. Those 3 names were carved into her memory deeper than any physical inscription, and honoring them had become as automatic as breathing. Her medical expertise went far beyond what any civilian nursing program could provide. She could perform emergency surgery with improvised instruments, manage multiple trauma patients simultaneously without electronic monitoring equipment, and make rapid diagnostic decisions based on symptoms that would baffle most emergency room physicians. These skills hadn't come from textbooks or hospital training, but from environments where medical supplies were scarce, backup was unavailable, and failure meant watching people die who could have been saved with better resources. The other nurses respected her competence but found her intensity somewhat unsettling. Maria Santos had once tried to engage her in casual conversation during a break, asking about her background and training. Rose Jean's responses had been polite but vague, offering just enough information to satisfy basic curiosity without revealing anything substantive about her past. "I trained at several different facilities," Rose Jean had said when asked about her education. "Military medicine emphasizes adaptability and resource management. Did you serve overseas?" Maria had pressed, sensing there was more to the story. "I served where I was needed," Rose Jean had replied, her voice carrying a finality that discouraged further questions. These conversations always ended the same way, with Rose Jean politely deflecting personal inquiries while maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that made it difficult to push for more information. Her colleagues eventually learned to accept her privacy while appreciating her professional contributions, though many remained curious about the experiences that had shaped her exceptional abilities. Dr. Henderson had noticed Rose Jean's unusual competence, but he'd interpreted it as a threat to his authority rather than an asset to the hospital. During staff meetings, when she offered suggestions or insights that demonstrated knowledge beyond her supposed qualifications, he would dismiss her contributions with barely concealed irritation. "That's an interesting theory, Martinez," he would say in a tone that suggested the opposite, "but perhaps we should focus on proven protocols rather than untested ideas." What Henderson didn't realize was that Rose Jean's untested ideas were actually field-proven techniques that had saved lives in circumstances far more challenging than anything Memorial Veterans Hospital typically encountered. Her suggestions for improving trauma response protocols came from experience managing mass casualty events with limited resources. Her insights into emergency triage were based on decisions she'd made when the difference between immediate and delayed treatment meant the difference between life and death for multiple patients. Rose Jean never pushed back against Henderson's dismissals, never insisted on explaining the basis for her recommendations. She would simply nod acknowledgement and continue with her assigned duties, filing away her suggestions for times when they might be implemented without triggering his defensive ego. This pattern of backing down reinforced Henderson's perception of her as weak and unsuitable for leadership roles, when in reality it demonstrated the kind of tactical patience that came from understanding when to fight and when to preserve resources for battles that truly mattered. The irony was lost on Henderson, but not on some of the more experienced staff members who recognized competence when they saw it. Dr. Thompson, in particular, had begun paying closer attention to Rose Jean's behavior and responses, looking for clues that might confirm the growing suspicion that had been triggered by that brief glimpse of the pendant with 3 crosses. Thompson's own military background included 2 tours as a field surgeon, and she'd heard stories about medics who performed extraordinary feats under impossible conditions. There were legends whispered in military medical circles about operations so classified that even their existence was questionable, about medical personnel who'd done things that seemed to defy human capability and military doctrine. One story in particular had stuck with Thompson over the years, something she'd heard from a helicopter pilot who'd been involved in medical evacuations from particularly dangerous zones. He'd spoken of a nurse who'd carried 3 wounded soldiers through an active minefield, navigating by memory and instinct when electronic guidance systems failed. The operation had been so sensitive that all records had been classified above his clearance level, but he'd never forgotten the pilot's description of what he'd witnessed. "I've seen some incredible things in 20 years of military service," the pilot had told Thompson, but watching that nurse carry 3 grown men to safety through terrain that could have killed them all, that was something beyond courage. That was someone who understood that some missions matter more than personal survival. Now, watching Rose Jean navigate Henderson's harassment with the same kind of calm competence the pilot had described, Thompson was beginning to wonder if the legendary nurse from that story and the quiet woman working night shifts at Memorial Veterans Hospital might be the same person. The possibility both thrilled and concerned her. If Rose Jean was who Thompson suspected she might be, then Henderson's campaign of harassment wasn't just unprofessional. It was an attack on someone whose service record included acts of heroism that most people couldn't imagine. But it also meant that Rose Jean was carrying burdens that went far beyond anything her civilian colleagues could understand, and that her quiet demeanor might be masking trauma that needed professional attention. As Thompson watched Rose Jean finish her shift and prepare to leave for the day, she made a decision that would change everything for both of them. It was time to have a conversation that went beyond polite professional inquiries, time to ask questions that might finally reveal the truth about who Rose Jean Martinez really was and what she'd done before arriving at Memorial Veterans Hospital. With credentials that were impressive but mysteriously vague about specifics. The pendant caught the light one more time as Rose Jean adjusted her jacket, and Thompson caught another glimpse of those 3 small crosses. This time, she was certain she recognized them. They weren't religious symbols at all, but military decorations so rare that most people would never encounter them in civilian life. If she was right about what they represented, then Rose Jean Martinez wasn't just an exceptional nurse with an unusual background. She was a living legend who'd been hiding in plain sight, enduring harassment from someone who had no idea that he was attacking one of the most decorated medical personnel in recent military history. Dr. Henderson's campaign against Rose Jean escalated with the methodical precision of a military operation, though he lacked the strategic thinking that made real military operations effective. His attacks became more frequent, more public, and increasingly personal as his frustration grew over her refusal to break under pressure that would have destroyed most people. The first major escalation came during a mandatory staff training session on trauma protocols. Henderson had deliberately scheduled Rose Jean to present a section on emergency triage, knowing full well that he planned to humiliate her in front of the entire medical staff. As she stood before 40 doctors, nurses, and medical technicians, he interrupted her presentation with a series of increasingly hostile questions designed to undermine her credibility. Martinez, he called out from the back of the conference room, his voice cutting through her explanation of battlefield triage principles. Exactly where did you learn these procedures? Because frankly, what you're describing sounds more like military fantasy than practical hospital medicine. Rose Zhang paused at the podium, her hand steady on the presentation remote despite the attack she'd been expecting. These protocols have been proven effective in high-stress, resource-limited environments. Dr. Henderson, the principles adapt well to civilian emergency situations where rapid decision-making is critical. Resource-limited environments, Henderson repeated mockingly, rising from his seat to ensure everyone could see his performance. Are you suggesting that Memorial Veterans Hospital operates with inadequate resources? Because if so, perhaps you'd be more comfortable working somewhere that better matches your limited expectations. The room buzzed with uncomfortable energy as staff members realized they were witnessing something that went far beyond professional disagreement. Dr. Patricia Wells, the hospital's chief of emergency medicine, shifted uncomfortably in her front row seat, recognizing that Henderson was using a mandatory training session as a platform for personal vendetta. Rose Jean's response was characteristically composed, but those who knew what to look for could see the slight tightening around her eyes. That suggested she was managing impulses that went far beyond simple frustration. I'm suggesting that efficient triage protocols save lives regardless of the setting. Dr. Henderson, the techniques I'm presenting have been field-tested under extreme conditions and proven effective. Field-tested, Henderson seized on the phrase with theatrical triumph. By whom? Where? Under what circumstances? Because your personnel file is remarkably vague about the specific details of this supposed field experience. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Rose Zhang stood perfectly still at the podium, her finger unconsciously moving to touch the pendant hidden beneath her professional blazer. The gesture was so subtle that most people missed it, but Dr. Thompson, who had positioned herself where she could observe Rose Jean's reactions, caught the movement and understood its significance. My experience includes various medical training exercises and deployment scenarios, Rose Zhang replied, offering the same carefully neutral language that had protected operational security for years. The specific details aren't relevant to the protocols we're discussing today. Henderson's eyes lit up with malicious satisfaction. Aren't they relevant? I think the medical staff of this hospital deserves to know exactly what qualifies you to lecture us on emergency procedures. Either you have real experience worth discussing, or you're wasting everyone's time with theoretical speculation. Dr. Wells finally intervened, her voice carrying the authority that came with 15 years of emergency medicine leadership. Dr. Henderson, I think we should allow Nurse Martinez to complete her presentation. The protocol she's outlined are consistent with current best practices, and we can address personnel questions through appropriate channels after the training session. But Henderson was too invested in his public performance to back down gracefully. With all due respect, Dr. Wells, I think transparency about our staff's qualifications is exactly the kind of issue we should address openly. If Martinez has the experience she claims, she should be proud to share the details. If she doesn't, we need to know that too. The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Rose Zhang could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes waiting for her response, could sense the mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and professional judgment that would shape how her colleagues viewed her going forward. She could also feel something else, something Henderson had triggered with his insistence on details that she'd spent years learning to keep classified. The experience I'm drawing on for these protocols, she said carefully, includes medical operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other locations where standard hospital procedures weren't applicable. The specific operations remain classified, but the medical principles I've extracted from that experience are appropriate for civilian emergency medicine. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Few people had suspected that the quiet night nurse had extensive combat medical experience, and the revelation shifted the dynamic of Henderson's attack in ways he hadn't anticipated. Instead of exposing weakness, he'd inadvertently revealed expertise that made his own credentials look superficial by comparison. Henderson's face flushed with anger as he realized his strategy had backfired. "Classified operations," he said with undisguised skepticism. How conveniently unverifiable. Anyone can claim classified experience as an excuse for vague credentials. Dr. Thompson stood up from her seat, her voice carrying the weight of her own military service. "Dr. Henderson, I think you should be very careful about questioning someone's military service record without evidence to support your suspicions. False accusations of stolen valor are serious matters with serious consequences." The warning was clear, and Henderson found himself in the uncomfortable position of having pushed his attack beyond the boundaries of professional disagreement into territory that could have legal implications. He'd expected to expose Rose Jiang as a fraud, but instead he'd revealed his own ignorance about military medical service and his willingness to attack a veteran without justification. "I'm simply asking for transparency," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Surely that's not unreasonable in a professional medical environment." Rose Jiang used the opening to regain control of the situation with the kind of tactical awareness that came from experience in much more dangerous confrontations. "I understand your concern about qualifications, Dr. Henderson. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting with Dr. Wells to review my credentials in detail, rather than using training time intended to benefit patient care." The suggestion was perfectly reasonable and professionally appropriate, which made Henderson's continued aggression look petty and inappropriate by comparison. Dr. Wells seized the opportunity to restore order to the training session. "That's an excellent suggestion, Dr. Henderson. Please see me after the training session to schedule an appropriate time for personnel discussions. Nurse Martinez, please continue with your presentation." Henderson had no choice but to sit down, his face burning with embarrassment at having been outmaneuvered by the same person he'd been trying to humiliate. But his humiliation only intensified his determination to destroy Rose Jiang's reputation and force her resignation, leading him to escalate his harassment in ways that would ultimately expose him to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. Second major escalation came 2 weeks later during a night shift when the emergency department was dealing with multiple trauma cases from an industrial accident. A construction crane had collapsed at a downtown building site, crushing several workers and creating the kind of mass casualty situation that tested every aspect of a hospital's emergency response capabilities. Rose Jiang was working triage when the first ambulances arrived, her training automatically taking over as she assessed injuries and directed patients to appropriate treatment areas. Her years of managing battlefield casualties had prepared her for exactly this kind of chaos, and she moved through the emergency department with calm efficiency that kept the entire response organized and effective. Henderson arrived 20 minutes after the first ambulances, having been called in from home to help manage the crisis. He found the emergency department running with military precision under Rose Jiang's informal coordination, with patients being treated according to medical priority rather than order of arrival, and resources being allocated based on tactical assessment of which cases required immediate intervention. Instead of recognizing the effectiveness of Rose Jiang's leadership, Henderson saw it as an usurpation of his authority. He watched her directing other nurses and communicating with physicians with the kind of natural command presence that made his own leadership style look forced and artificial. "Martinez," he called out loudly enough for everyone in the department to hear, "exactly who authorized you to take charge of this response? Last I checked, you're a nurse, not an incident commander." Rose Jiang was in the middle of coordinating with a surgeon about a patient with internal bleeding, but she paused to respond without losing her focus on the medical emergency at hand. I'm providing triage support to help manage patient flow. Dr. Henderson, Dr. Rodriguez asked me to help coordinate since I have experience with mass casualty incidents. Experience with mass casualty incidents, Henderson repeated sarcastically, moving closer to disrupt her coordination activities. And exactly what experience is that? Because I don't see any disaster management certifications in your file. Dr. Rodriguez, who had indeed asked Rose-Jean to help coordinate the response, looked up from the patient he was treating with visible irritation. Henderson, can this wait? We've got 7 critical patients and more ambulances arriving. Rose knows what she's doing. But Henderson was too committed to his confrontation to back down, even in the middle of a medical emergency. That's exactly the problem, Rodriguez. We're allowing unqualified personnel to make decisions that should be handled by properly credentialed medical professionals. The accusation was so inappropriate in the middle of a crisis that several staff members stopped what they were doing to stare at Henderson in disbelief. Dr. Rodriguez's expression shifted from irritation to genuine anger. Unqualified? Rose has been managing this response better than anyone else here. Her triage decisions have been perfect, her resource allocation has been flawless, and her coordination has probably saved at least 2 lives in the last hour. What exactly is your problem with her competence? Henderson's response revealed the depth of his personal vendetta and his complete lack of understanding about emergency medical response. My problem is that she's operating outside her scope of practice, making decisions that require medical knowledge and experience she doesn't possess and potentially endangering patients with her unauthorized initiatives. Rose-Jean continued working throughout this exchange, her hands steady as she started in 4 on a patient with multiple fractures, while simultaneously directing another nurse to prepare emergency blood products for a different patient. Her ability to maintain medical focus while under personal attack demonstrated exactly the kind of professional composure that came from experience in environments where distractions could be fatal. Dr. Henderson, she said without looking up from her patient, I'm following standard mass casualty protocols and working under Dr. Rodriguez's supervision. If you have specific concerns about my medical decisions, perhaps we could discuss them after we've stabilized all the patients. The reasonableness of her response, delivered while she was actively saving lives, made Henderson's continued harassment look not just inappropriate, but actively harmful to patient care. Dr. Rodriguez finally lost patience with the entire confrontation. Henderson, either help with the medical response or get out of the way. We don't have time for whatever personal issue you have with Rose. People are dying, and she's helping save them. The blunt dismissal from a respected emergency physician in front of the entire medical staff was a professional humiliation that Henderson would never forgive. But instead of recognizing that his behavior was inappropriate, he interpreted the rebuke as evidence that Rose-Jean was successfully turning his colleagues against him through manipulation and deception. His response was to launch a systematic campaign designed to isolate Rose-Jean from her colleagues and undermine her professional relationships throughout the hospital. He began spreading rumors about her qualifications, questioning her judgment in conversations with other department heads, and documenting every minor irregularity in her work as evidence of incompetence. The campaign included subtle sabotage, designed to create situations where Rose-Jean would appear to fail. Medical supplies would disappear from her assignments, forcing her to improvise or request replacements that made her look unprepared. Her shift schedules would be changed without notice, creating conflicts that generated documentation of attendance problems. Equipment she needed for patient care would mysteriously malfunction, requiring her to find alternative solutions that looked like protocol violations to administrators who didn't understand the full context. But Henderson underestimated both Rose-Jean's adaptability and the loyalty of colleagues who had witnessed her competence firsthand. Dr. Rodriguez began documenting Henderson's interference with medical operations, creating a paper trail that would eventually become crucial evidence. In formal proceedings, Nurse Sarah Chun started keeping detailed records of the equipment failures and scheduling irregularities that seemed to target only Rose Zhang, recognizing patterns that suggested deliberate sabotage. Most importantly, Dr. Thompson began her own investigation into Rose Jean's background, using her security clearance and military connections to access information that Henderson couldn't obtain through normal personnel channels. What she discovered would eventually provide the ammunition needed to destroy Henderson's career while protecting someone whose service record included acts of heroism that most people couldn't imagine. The final escalation in Henderson's campaign came during a hospital-wide quality assurance review when he formally accused Rose Zhang of practicing outside her scope, endangering patients through unauthorized medical decisions, and misrepresenting her qualifications on employment documents. The accusations were serious enough to trigger a formal investigation that could result in her termination and the loss of her nursing license. Henderson thought he had finally found the weapon that would destroy Rose Jean's career and vindicate his months of harassment. What he didn't realize was that his formal accusations would open official channels of inquiry that would eventually expose not just Rose Jean's true background, but also his own professional misconduct and the systematic harassment he'd been conducting under the cover of legitimate supervisory authority. The investigation would reveal records that had been sealed for national security reasons, service citations that had been classified to protect operational details, and testimonials from military personnel whose lives had been saved by someone whose courage under fire had become legendary in certain military medical circles. Henderson had spent months trying to prove that Rose Zhang Martinez was a fraud hiding behind false credentials and stolen valor. Instead, he was about to discover that he'd been systematically harassing someone whose actual service record included acts of heroism so extraordinary that they'd been classified at the highest levels of military security. The quiet nurse who'd endured his attacks without retaliation wasn't hiding from a fraudulent past. She was protecting a genuine heroic legacy that would soon be revealed in ways that would end his career and vindicate every colleague who'd recognized her exceptional competence despite his campaign to destroy her reputation. Dr. Margaret Thompson's investigation began in the secure communications room of Memorial Veterans Hospital, a soundproof chamber originally designed for telemedicine consultations with military medical facilities overseas. Her security clearance, maintained through her reserve officer status, gave her access to databases that civilian hospital administrators never saw. What she discovered in those first few hours of searching would change everything she thought she knew about Rose Zhang Martinez. The initial search yielded fragments scattered across multiple classified systems, each piece protected by different levels of security clearance. Rose Jean's service record had been deliberately compartmentalized, with operational details separated from personal information to protect both national security and the individuals involved in highly sensitive missions. Thompson's clearance was high enough to access medical records and unit assignments, but the specific details of Rose Jean's most significant operations remained locked behind classification levels that required special authorization. What Thompson could see was tantalizing in its implications. Multiple commendations for medical excellence under combat conditions. Unit assignments that placed Rose Zhang in the most dangerous areas of operation during the height of the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Medical save rates that defied statistical probability under the conditions described in the available portions of after-action reports. Most significantly, Thompson found references to something called Operation Shepherd's Cross, a mission so heavily classified that even its existence was marked with security warnings that made Thompson's stomach clench with growing understanding. The few details available indicated that Operation Shepherd's Cross had involved the rescue of coalition personnel from a location designated as extremely hostile. with significant ordnance hazards requiring specialized navigation expertise. Under enemy fire. Thompson had been a field surgeon long enough to recognize military euphemisms when she saw them. Extremely hostile meant active combat with enemy forces in close proximity. Significant ordnance hazards meant mines, unexploded, artillery, or other explosive devices that could kill anyone who made a single wrong step. Specialized navigation expertise under enemy fire meant someone with the skills and courage to guide others through deadly terrain while being shot at by people trying to kill them. The medical citations associated with Operation Shepherd's Cross were even more revealing. 3 Purple Hearts awarded to personnel identified only by number codes, indicating they'd been wounded in action during the mission. Multiple Bronze Stars for valor under fire. And 1 Medal of Honor recommendation that had been submitted but never processed. The paperwork trail ending abruptly with a classification stamp that suggested the entire award process had been buried. For security reasons, Thompson cross-referenced the dates and locations with her own military experience, trying to place Operation Shepherd's Cross within the broader context of military operations during that time period. What she found made her lean back in her chair with growing amazement and horror at what Rose Zhang had endured, not just during her military service, but in the months of harassment she'd suffered at Henderson's hands. The time frame corresponded with some of the heaviest fighting in Helmand Province, a region where coalition forces faced determined resistance and sophisticated, explosive devices that turned every patrol into a life-or-death navigation challenge. Medical personnel operating in that environment faced constant danger from sniper fire, artillery attacks, and improvised explosive devices that could destroy entire medical facilities without warning. For someone to have performed medical rescues in that environment wasn't just heroic, it represented a level of courage and competence that belonged in military history books. The fact that Rose Zhang had not only survived such operations, but had apparently excelled at them, suggested that Henderson had been systematically harassing someone whose actual qualifications far exceeded anything he could claim from his entirely administrative military career. Thompson's next step was to contact Colonel David Harrison, her former commanding officer, who now worked in military medical administration at the Pentagon. Harrison's security clearance was high enough to access the complete records of Operation Shepherd's Cross, and his 25 years of military medical experience would help him understand the significance of what Thompson was discovering. The secure call connected to the second ring, and Harrison's familiar voice carried the warmth of genuine friendship mixed with professional curiosity about why Thompson was requesting access to highly classified medical records. "Margaret, it's good to hear from you," Harrison said after the encrypted connection was established. "Your message mentioned you need information about Operation Shepherd's Cross and a medical specialist named Martinez. That's a name and operation I haven't thought about in years. You know about it?" Thompson asked, her pulse quickening with the realization that she was finally going to get answers about Rose Jean's mysterious background. "Know about it?" Harrison's voice carried a mixture of admiration and something that sounded like awe. "Margaret, Operation Shepherd's Cross was one of the most extraordinary medical rescues in modern military history. The fact that you're asking about it suggests you've encountered someone very special, and possibly someone who's been hiding the most remarkable service record I've ever seen." Harrison's words confirmed Thompson's growing suspicions, but she needed specific details that would help her understand exactly what Rose Zhang had done and why she'd been working as a night nurse at a civilian hospital instead of receiving the recognition her service record clearly deserved. "David, I need to know what really happened during Operation Shepherd's Cross. I think the person involved is working at my hospital, and she's being systematically harassed by someone who has no idea what he's attacking." The silence on the other end of the secure line stretched long enough to make Thompson wonder if the connection had been lost. When Harrison finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying this story too significant to forget, but too classified to share. Margaret, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave the secure channels we're using now. Operation Shepherd's Cross involved the rescue of 3 coalition soldiers who'd been captured during a reconnaissance mission that went wrong. The soldiers were being held in a compound surrounded by an active minefield, with enemy forces controlling all the approaches. Thompson listened with growing amazement as Harrison described the tactical situation that had made Operation Shepherd's Cross necessary. The captured soldiers were wounded and would die without immediate medical attention. But conventional rescue operations were impossible due to the minefield and enemy positions that commanded all the surrounding terrain. The mission planners were looking at writing off 3 good soldiers because the risk of additional casualties was too high, Harrison continued. That's when Specialist Rose-Jean Martinez volunteered for what everyone assumed would be a suicide mission. The use of Rose-Jean's full name confirmed Thompson's suspicions, but what Harrison described next went far beyond anything she'd imagined about the quiet nurse who'd been enduring Henderson's harassment with such remarkable composure. Martinez had grown up in rural New Mexico, where her grandfather had taught her to navigate desert terrain by reading subtle signs that most people would never notice. She'd also received specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal, not because it was her primary job, but because medical personnel in forward areas needed to understand how to work around unexploded devices. Harrison paused, and Thompson could hear him taking a deep breath before continuing with the most extraordinary part of the story. She went into that minefield alone, carrying medical supplies and enough equipment to stabilize 3 wounded soldiers for transport. No electronic guidance systems because they would have revealed her position to enemy forces. No backup because sending more people would have multiplied the risk without improving the chances of success. Thompson found herself holding her breath as Harrison described how Rose-Jean had navigated through the minefield using techniques her grandfather had taught her for reading the subtle signs that indicated disturbed ground. How she'd reached the compound where the soldiers were being held and provided emergency medical treatment under conditions that would have broken most people. But that was just the beginning, Harrison said, his voice growing more intense as he reached the climax of the story. Getting to the soldiers was dangerous enough, but getting them out required her to carry each one individually through the minefield, making 3 separate trips while under enemy fire. The magnitude of what Rose-Jean had accomplished hit Thompson like a physical blow. Carrying 3 wounded soldiers through an active minefield, one at a time, while being shot at by enemy forces represented a level of courage and competence that belonged in military legend. The fact that she'd successfully completed all 3 rescues without triggering any explosive devices suggested skills that went far beyond standard military training. All 3 soldiers survived, Harrison concluded. Martinez's medical treatment stabilized them enough for transport, and her navigation skills got them through terrain that should have killed everyone involved. The entire operation was classified because it revealed capabilities that military intelligence wanted to keep secret from enemy forces. Thompson struggled to process the implications of what she'd learned. Rose-Jean Martinez wasn't just an experienced combat medic with an impressive service record. She was someone who'd performed one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in recent military history. Someone whose courage and competence had saved 3 lives under conditions that most people couldn't survive, let alone succeed in. David, why is someone with that kind of service record working as a night nurse instead of receiving the recognition she clearly deserves? Harrison's sigh carried the weight of institutional frustration and personal regret. Because she specifically requested that her service record be classified and that she be allowed to return to civilian life without the media attention that usually comes with Medal of Honor recipients. She said she didn't want to be celebrated for doing what she saw as her basic duty as a medic. The explanation fit perfectly with everything Thompson had observed about Rose Jean's character. Her refusal to defend herself against Henderson's attacks, her insistence on working quietly without seeking recognition, her apparent comfort with being underestimated and overlooked. These weren't signs of weakness, as Henderson had assumed, but evidence of someone who'd already faced the ultimate test of courage and had no need to prove herself to anyone. "There's something else you need to know," Harrison added, his voice growing more serious. "The 3 soldiers Martinez rescued, they've all stayed in touch with her over the years. They consider her family, and they take any threat to her welfare very personally. If someone is harassing her, and if she decides she needs help dealing with it, she has some very capable friends who would be happy to provide assistance." The warning was clear, though Thompson suspected that Rose Jean would never ask for that kind of help. Her approach to Henderson's harassment suggested someone who preferred to handle problems through official channels rather than personal intervention. But it was useful to know that she had options if the situation escalated beyond what civilian authorities could manage. Thompson's next step was to document everything she'd learned in a way that could be used to protect Rose Jean from Henderson's accusations while respecting the classification requirements that protected operational details. She began preparing a report that would provide hospital administrators with enough information to understand Rose Jean's qualifications without revealing specifics that could compromise national security. Meanwhile, Henderson was conducting his own investigation. Though his efforts were focused on gathering evidence to support his accusations, rather than discovering the truth about Rose Jean's background. He'd been meeting with allies throughout the hospital administration, building a case that Rose Jean represented a liability that needed to be eliminated before she caused serious damage to the hospital's reputation. His investigation had uncovered the gaps in Rose Jean's employment history that corresponded with her military service. But instead of recognizing these as evidence of classified operations, he'd interpreted them as proof of deception. The vague references to medical training and field experience that protected operational security looked like deliberately misleading information designed to hide a lack of real qualifications. Henderson had also been reaching out to contacts in other hospitals, trying to find evidence of previous problems or disciplinary actions that would support his characterization of Rose Jean as an incompetent nurse who'd been systematically deceiving employers about her capabilities. What he'd found instead were glowing recommendations from supervisors who described her as one of the most competent medical professionals they'd ever worked with. But Henderson interpreted these positive reviews as evidence that Rose Jean had successfully manipulated previous employers, just as she was manipulating her current colleagues. The formal investigation Henderson had demanded was being conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the hospital's chief medical officer who had the authority to review personnel files and interview relevant staff members. Carter's military background included service as a Navy medical officer, and she understood the complexities of transitioning from military to civilian medical practice. Carter's review of Rose Jean's file immediately raised questions that Henderson hadn't anticipated. The medical certifications were legitimate and current, but they included specializations that were rarely seen in civilian nursing programs. The letters of recommendation came from military medical officers whose credentials Carter recognized as belonging to some of the most respected combat medical professionals in recent history. Most significantly, Carter noticed discrepancies between Henderson's accusations and the documented evidence of Rose Jean's performance. Patient outcomes during Rose Jean's shifts were consistently better than hospital averages. Her response times to medical emergencies were faster than established benchmarks. Her diagnostic accuracy exceeded that of many physicians with significantly more experience. Carter's preliminary findings suggested that, instead of investigating incompetence, she was documenting exceptional performance that had somehow triggered A harassment campaign from a supervisor whose own qualifications were increasingly questionable. The investigation that Henderson had expected to result in Rose Jean's termination was instead revealing patterns of behavior that suggested he was the one whose employment should be reconsidered. As the various investigations converged, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would finally reveal the truth about Rose Jean Martinez and expose the depth of Henderson's professional misconduct. The quiet nurse who'd endured months of harassment without retaliation was about to be vindicated in ways that would shock everyone who'd witnessed her persecution. But the revelation would come at a cost that Rose Jean had spent years trying to avoid. Her carefully maintained anonymity was about to be shattered. Her classified service record was about to become public knowledge, and the recognition she'd specifically requested to avoid was about to be thrust upon her whether she wanted it or not. The investigation phase was drawing to a close, and the discovery phase was about to begin with revelations that would change how everyone at Memorial Veterans Hospital understood courage, competence, and the true meaning of heroic service. The breaking point arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, during Memorial Veterans Hospital's quarterly board meeting, an event that brought together the hospital's most senior administrators, department heads, and distinguished board members for a comprehensive review of operations and performance. Henderson had been planning this moment for weeks, seeing the high-profile gathering as the perfect stage for his final assault on Rose Jean's career. The boardroom buzzed with the controlled energy of institutional power as 23 of the region's most influential medical professionals took their seats around the polished mahogany conference table. Hospital CEO Dr. Robert Madison called the meeting to order with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex medical institutions, his agenda covering everything from budget allocations to quality assurance metrics. Henderson had positioned himself strategically at the table where he could command attention when his moment arrived. He'd spent the previous evening rehearsing his presentation, fine-tuning accusations designed to destroy Rose Jean's reputation while positioning himself as the vigilant supervisor who'd identified a dangerous fraud before she could cause irreparable harm to the hospital's mission. Rose Jean had been assigned to work the overnight shift that preceded the morning meeting, a scheduling choice that Henderson thought would demonstrate her peripheral importance to hospital operations. What he didn't anticipate was that her night shift would provide the perfect setup for the confrontation he was orchestrating, creating circumstances that would expose his accusations as not just false, but spectacularly inappropriate. At 2:47 a.m., 3 hours before the board meeting was scheduled to begin, Memorial Veterans Hospital received a call that would change everything. A military transport plane had experienced mechanical failure during an emergency landing at the nearby airbase, resulting in multiple casualties that exceeded the base medical facility's capacity. 22 injured service members were being transported to Memorial for immediate treatment, with arrival times staggered over the next 4 hours. Rose Jean was working as the night supervisor when the call came in, and her response demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and medical expertise that Henderson had been trying to discredit for months. She immediately activated the hospital's mass casualty protocols, coordinating with multiple departments to ensure that adequate staff, supplies, and equipment would be available when the injured soldiers arrived. Her coordination was flawless, drawing on experience from managing similar situations in combat zones where resources were limited and mistakes could be fatal. She directed the emergency department staff to prepare trauma bays, contacted off-duty physicians and nurses to request emergency coverage, and arranged for specialized equipment that would be needed for the types of injuries commonly associated with aircraft accidents. When the first ambulances arrived at 3:15 a.m., Rose Jean was ready with a triage system that efficiently directed each patient to appropriate treatment areas based on the severity of their injuries. Her assessment of each case was rapid and accurate, identifying priority patients who needed immediate surgery while ensuring that less Critical cases received appropriate care without overwhelming the available resources. Dr. Patricia Wells, who had been called in to oversee the emergency response, watched Rose Jean's performance with growing amazement. The night nurse was managing the complex medical crisis with the kind of calm competence that usually took years of emergency medicine experience to develop. Her communication with physicians was precise and informative. Her coordination with support staff was seamless, and her medical decisions consistently demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond standard nursing education. "Rose," Dr. Wells said, during a brief break between ambulance arrivals, "where did you learn to manage mass casualty situations like this? Your coordination has been absolutely flawless." Rose Jean's response was characteristically modest, but the depth of experience behind it was unmistakable. "I've had some training in emergency response protocols, Dr. Wells. The principles are similar regardless of the setting." What Rose Jean didn't mention was that the training Dr. Wells was observing had been forged in forward operating bases, where mass casualty events were routine and the margin for error was measured in lives rather than performance metrics. Every decision she made, every coordination protocol she implemented, every triage assessment she performed, was informed by experience in environments where similar mistakes would have resulted in preventable deaths. By 6 a.m., when the last of the injured soldiers had been admitted and treated, Rose Jean had successfully managed the largest emergency response in Memorial Veterans Hospital's recent history. All 22 patients had been stabilized, with 15 requiring surgery and 7 needing extended intensive care. Not a single preventable complication had occurred, and the entire response had been completed with military precision that impressed everyone involved. Dr. Wells made a point of documenting Rose Jean's performance in the incident report that would be submitted to hospital administration, noting specifically that her leadership had been instrumental in preventing what could have been a chaotic and potentially dangerous situation from overwhelming the hospital's emergency response capabilities. Henderson arrived at the hospital at 7:30 a.m. for the board meeting, expecting to present his accusations against Rose Jean to an audience that would be focused on routine administrative matters. Instead, he found the hospital still buzzing with excitement over the successful emergency response that had just concluded, with staff members throughout the building talking about the exceptional leadership they'd witnessed from the quiet night. Nurse. The timing couldn't have been worse for Henderson's planned attack. Board members arriving for the meeting were being briefed on the emergency response as an example of Memorial Veterans Hospital's readiness to handle complex medical crises. Rose Jean's name was being mentioned repeatedly as the key coordinator, whose expertise had made the difference between success and potential disaster. Henderson realized that his carefully planned presentation would now be delivered to an audience that had just heard glowing reports about Rose Jean's competence and leadership. Instead of acknowledging that circumstances had undermined his accusations, he decided to double down on his attack, convinced that he could still expose what he saw as her fraudulent credentials, despite the evidence of her actual performance. Board meeting began with CEO Dr. Madison's briefing on the overnight emergency response, which included specific praise for Rose Jean's coordination and management of the mass casualty situation. Board members asked detailed questions about the hospital's emergency preparedness protocols, and Dr. Wells provided enthusiastic testimony about Rose Jean's role in ensuring the successful outcome. "The coordination we witnessed this morning," Dr. Wells told the board, "represents exactly the kind of emergency medical leadership that separates excellent hospitals from merely adequate ones." Nurse Martinez's performance was simply outstanding. Henderson listened to this praise with growing frustration, recognizing that his accusations would now be seen as attacks on someone who just demonstrated exceptional competence under pressure. But his commitment to destroying Rose Jean's career had become so personal that he couldn't abandon his campaign even when circumstances clearly favored her. When Dr. Madison opened the floor for department reports and special concerns, Henderson, stood up with the confidence of someone who believed his institutional position would carry more weight than recent evidence of Rose Jean's capabilities. "Mr. Chairman, board members," Henderson began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd been rehearsing, "I need to address serious concerns about personnel issues in our nursing department that could affect patient safety and hospital liability." The board's attention shifted to Henderson with polite interest, though several members exchanged glances that suggested they were wondering why personnel concerns were being raised immediately after hearing about successful emergency response operations. Henderson continued with increasing intensity, his presentation becoming more dramatic as he attempted to overcome the positive impression Rose Zhang had just created through her performance during the night shift. "I've been conducting an investigation into the qualifications and performance of Nurse Rose Zhang Martinez, and I've discovered serious discrepancies that suggest she may be practicing outside her scope of training and potentially endangering patients through incompetent medical decisions." The silence that followed Henderson's accusation was heavy with tension. Board members who had just heard detailed praise for Rose Jean's emergency response leadership were now being told that the same person represented a danger to patient safety. The contradiction was so stark that several board members leaned forward with expressions that suggested they were questioning Henderson's judgment rather than Rose Jean's competence. Dr. Madison's response was carefully neutral, but his tone carried a warning that Henderson was too committed to his attack to recognize. "Dr. Henderson, these are serious accusations. I trust you have substantial evidence to support claims of incompetence and endangerment, especially given the positive reports we've just heard about Nurse Martinez's performance during this morning's emergency response." Henderson interpreted the question as an invitation to present his case rather than the caution it was intended to be. He produced a folder containing documentation he'd been gathering for months, spreading papers across the conference table with theatrical flourish designed to demonstrate the thoroughness of his investigation. "Board members, I have documented evidence of multiple instances where Martinez has operated outside established protocols, made medical decisions that exceed her qualifications, and provided misleading information about her background and training." As Henderson began detailing his accusations, Rose Zhang appeared in the doorway of the boardroom. She'd been summoned to answer questions about the emergency response protocols she'd implemented during the night shift, arriving just as Henderson reached the climax of his attack on her professional reputation. Her presence in the room created a moment of electric tension as board members realized they were witnessing a direct confrontation between the supervisor making accusations of incompetence and the nurse whose performance they'd just heard praised as exceptional. Rose Jean's expression remained composed, but those who knew what to look for could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was managing stress through techniques learned in much more dangerous circumstances. Henderson seized on her arrival as an opportunity to make his accusations more personal and dramatic. "As you can see, Martinez has the audacity to interrupt a board meeting where her professional misconduct is being discussed. This kind of inappropriate behavior is exactly what I've been trying to address through proper administrative channels." The accusation was so unfair that several board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Rose Zhang had clearly been summoned to the meeting, not barging in uninvited, and her presence was obviously related to the emergency response briefing, rather than an attempt to disrupt Henderson's presentation. Dr. Madison intervened with the authority that came from years of managing complex institutional politics. "Dr. Henderson, Nurse Martinez was requested to attend this meeting to provide details about the emergency response protocols. Her presence here is entirely appropriate." But Henderson was too committed to his performance to back down gracefully. "Appropriate? Nothing about Martinez's behavior has been appropriate since she arrived at this hospital. She consistently operates outside her qualifications, undermines physician authority, and represents exactly the kind of liability that this board should be concerned about." Rose Jean stood perfectly still throughout Henderson's tirade, her hands clasped behind her back, in a posture that seemed almost military in its precision. When Henderson finally paused for breath, she spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Dr. Henderson, I understand your concerns about my qualifications. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss the specific details of my background and training that you've been questioning." The suggestion was delivered with characteristic composure, but there was something in Rose Jean's tone that suggested Henderson had finally pushed her beyond the limits of her patience. For months, she'd absorbed his attacks without defending herself, but now he was making accusations in front of the hospital's board of directors that could affect not just her career, but her ability to serve the patients who depended on her expertise. Henderson's eyes lit up with malicious satisfaction. "Excellent suggestion, Martinez. Please share with the board the specific details of this mysterious military medical experience you claim to possess. Give us chapter and verse about these classified operations that conveniently can't be verified." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Rose Jean's fingers moved unconsciously to touch the pendant hidden beneath her professional blazer, tracing the outline of the 3 crosses that represented the most significant moment of her military career. The gesture was so subtle that most people missed it, but Dr. Thompson, who had positioned herself where she could observe the confrontation, caught the movement and understood its significance. "My military service," Rose Jean said carefully, "included medical operations in several combat zones where standard hospital procedures weren't applicable. The specific operations remain classified, but the medical principles I learned are directly relevant to civilian emergency medicine." Henderson's response revealed the depth of his ignorance about military medical service and his complete misunderstanding of classification requirements. Classified operations, mysterious training, unverifiable experience. Board members, this is exactly the kind of vague deflection I've been documenting for months. Either Martinez has real credentials worth discussing, or she's been deceiving this institution about her qualifications. The moment had arrived for truth to emerge, and Dr. Thompson made the decision that would change everything for both Rose Jean and Henderson. She stood up from her seat with the authority that came from her own distinguished military medical career. "Board members," Dr. Thompson said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "I think there are some things about Nurse Martinez's service record that Dr. Henderson doesn't understand." Dr. Thompson's words cut through the boardroom, tension like a surgical blade, and every eye in the room turned toward her with the kind of focused attention that recognized a pivotal moment about to unfold. Henderson's confident smirk began to falter as he realized that his carefully orchestrated attack was about to face opposition from someone whose own military credentials were beyond question. "Dr. Thompson," CEO Madison said, his voice carrying both curiosity and caution, "you mentioned that there are aspects of Nurse Martinez's service record that haven't been properly understood. Could you elaborate on that statement?" Thompson moved to the front of the boardroom, her bearing carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd earned respect through service rather than politics. She placed a secure tablet on the conference table, its screen displaying the seal of the Department of Defense and classification markings that made several board members lean forward with sudden interest. "Board members," Thompson began, her voice steady and authoritative, "I have a top-secret clearance maintained through my reserve officer status, which has allowed me to access certain military medical records that civilian administrators cannot review. What I've discovered about Rose Jean Martinez's service record is extraordinary, and it completely contradicts every accusation Dr. Henderson has made." Henderson's face flushed with anger as he realized his authority was being challenged by someone with credentials he couldn't match. "Dr. Thompson, I appreciate your military service, but we're discussing hospital personnel matters, not classified operations that may or may not be relevant to civilian medical practice." Thompson's response was delivered with the kind of measured authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Dr. Henderson, what I'm about to share is directly relevant to your accusations of incompetence and fraudulent credentials. Rose Jean Martinez didn't just serve in military medical operations. She's the recipient of honors so significant that they've been classified to protect operational security. The revelation hit the boardroom like a physical shock. Rose Zhang remained perfectly still, her expression controlled despite the obvious discomfort of having her carefully protected privacy about to be shattered. Her fingers moved unconsciously to the pendant beneath her blazer, tracing the 3 crosses that were about to become public knowledge after years of deliberate anonymity. Thompson continued, her voice growing stronger as she prepared to reveal information that would fundamentally change how everyone in the room understood the quiet nurse who'd been enduring months of harassment. Rose Zhang Martinez is the sole survivor and primary hero of Operation Shepherd's Cross, one of the most extraordinary rescue missions in recent military history. Board member Dr. Angela Foster, a Navy veteran herself, straightened in her chair. With sudden recognition, Operation Shepherd's Cross? I've heard references to that mission in classified briefings. Are you saying that Nurse Martinez was involved in that operation? She wasn't just involved, Thompson replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. She was the operation. 3 coalition soldiers had been captured and were being held in a compound surrounded by an active minefield. Conventional rescue operations were impossible due to enemy positions and explosive devices that made any approach suicidal. Henderson attempted to interrupt, his voice cracking with desperation as he sensed his accusations crumbling around him. This is exactly the kind of unverifiable story that Martinez has been using to deflect legitimate questions about her qualifications. Anyone can claim classified heroics to avoid accountability. Thompson's response silenced Henderson with the force of documented truth. Dr. Henderson, I have the complete after-action reports right here. Rose Jean Martinez volunteered for what military planners considered a suicide mission. She entered that minefield alone, carrying medical supplies and enough equipment to stabilize 3 critically wounded soldiers. The boardroom fell into complete silence as Thompson described the tactical situation that had made Operation Shepherd's Cross necessary. Enemy forces controlling all the approaches to the compound. Sophisticated explosive devices that could kill anyone who made a single wrong step. Wounded soldiers who would die without immediate medical intervention that couldn't be provided through conventional rescue operations. Martinez navigated through that minefield using terrain reading techniques her grandfather had taught her for desert survival. Thompson continued, her voice growing more intense as she reached the most extraordinary part of the story. She reached the compound, provided emergency medical treatment to stabilize the wounded soldiers, and then carried each one individually back through the minefield to safety. Dr. Foster's professional composure cracked as the magnitude of what Thompson was describing hit her. She made 3 separate trips through an active minefield while under enemy fire, carrying wounded soldiers. That's not just heroic, that's nearly impossible. All 3 soldiers survived, Thompson confirmed, her voice carrying the finality of documented fact. Martinez's medical treatment stabilized them for transport, and her navigation skills got them through terrain that should have killed everyone involved. The entire operation was classified because it revealed capabilities that military intelligence wanted to keep secret. Henderson's face had gone white as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Every accusation he'd made about Rose Jean's incompetence was being systematically destroyed by evidence of heroism so extraordinary that it belonged in military legend. But his pride and institutional position prevented him from accepting defeat gracefully. Even if this story is true, Henderson said, his voice desperate with the need to salvage something from his collapsing position, it doesn't excuse operating outside protocols in a civilian hospital setting. Military experience doesn't automatically qualify someone for hospital leadership responsibilities. The objection was so tone-deaf that several board members exchanged glances that suggested Henderson's judgment was now being questioned. More seriously than Rose Jean's qualifications, Dr. Madison's response carried the controlled anger of someone who'd realized that his hospital had been systematically mistreating a genuine hero. Dr. Henderson, are you seriously suggesting that someone who successfully performed emergency medicine in a combat zone while under enemy fire is somehow unqualified to work in our emergency department? But Thompson wasn't finished with her revelations. She touched the tablet screen, bringing up additional documentation that would complete Henderson's professional destruction while vindicating every colleague who'd recognized Rose Jean's exceptional competence. There's more that the board needs to understand, Thompson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting incontrovertible evidence. The 3 soldiers Rose Jean rescued weren't random casualties. They were her own team members, medics who'd been captured while providing medical support to other units. The additional detail transformed the story from extraordinary military heroism into something even more profound. Rose Jean hadn't just risked her life to save wounded soldiers. She'd gone back for her own people, refusing to abandon teammates despite odds that made survival unlikely for any of them. The medical citations associated with Operation Shepherd's Cross, Thompson continued, include recommendations for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork was never processed because Martinez specifically requested that her service record be classified and that she be allowed to return to civilian life without public recognition. Board member Dr. Charles Wright, whose own military service included command positions in Iraq, leaned forward with an expression that mixed awe with growing anger at Henderson's treatment of someone whose service record exceeded anything he'd encountered in 30 years of military medicine. Dr. Thompson, are you telling us that we have a Medal of Honor candidate working night shifts in our hospital, and Dr. Henderson has been systematically harassing her for months? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Thompson replied, her voice carrying the finality of judgment. And there's documentation to prove that Dr. Henderson's accusations are not just wrong, but represent a systematic campaign of harassment against someone whose actual qualifications far exceed his own. Henderson made one final attempt to defend his position, his voice breaking with desperation as he realized that his career was collapsing around him. This is all very dramatic, but it doesn't address the specific incidents I've documented where Martinez operated outside established protocols and made unauthorized medical decisions. Rose Zhang finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd earned the right to command attention through actions rather than words. Dr. Henderson, every medical decision you've questioned was based on protocols designed to save lives under conditions where standard procedures wouldn't work. I've been trying to protect patients using techniques that were proven effective in environments far more challenging than anything we face here. Dr. Madison's response carried the controlled fury of someone who'd realized that institutional policies had been used to attack someone whose service deserved protection rather than persecution. Nurse Martinez, on behalf of this board and this hospital, I want to apologize for the treatment you've endured. Dr. Henderson's actions represent a complete failure of leadership and judgment. Thompson activated another screen on her tablet, displaying commendations and citations that painted a picture of military medical service so distinguished that it belonged in history books. Bronze stars for valor under fire. Purple hearts for wounds received while treating other casualties. Letters of commendation from officers whose own credentials were legendary in military medical circles. The pendant Rose Jing wears, Thompson said, her voice growing softer as she reached the most personal part of her revelation, contains the symbols of 3 military decorations that were awarded for Operation Shepherd's Cross. She's been carrying the evidence of her heroism around her neck while enduring months of accusations that she's incompetent and fraudulent. The irony was so profound that several board members shook their heads in disgust at Henderson's ignorance. The quiet nurse they'd been watching accept harassment without retaliation hadn't been hiding from a shameful past. She'd been protecting a heroic legacy that was too significant to exploit for personal advantage. Dr. Foster stood up from her seat, her voice carrying the respect that one veteran offered to another whose service had exceeded all normal expectations. "Nurse Martinez, why didn't you defend yourself against these accusations? Why didn't you tell us about your service record?" Rose Jean's response revealed the depth of character that had made her military service so extraordinary and her civilian persecution so tragic. "Because serving isn't about receiving recognition, Dr. Foster. It's about doing what needs to be done regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates the sacrifice involved." Henderson's final position crumbled as board members began asking questions about his own qualifications and service record, revealing that his military experience consisted entirely of administrative positions that had never involved actual medical service under challenging conditions. His accusations of stolen valor against Rose Zhang were particularly inappropriate, given that his own military career had been spent in safety while she'd been saving lives under enemy fire. CEO Madison's voice carried the finality of institutional judgment as he addressed the boardroom with the authority of someone whose responsibility included protecting the hospital's most valuable personnel. "Dr. Henderson, your conduct toward Nurse Martinez represents gross professional misconduct and a complete failure of supervisory responsibility. Your employment with this institution is terminated effective immediately." The termination was delivered with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that left no room for argument or appeal. Henderson's campaign to destroy Rose Jean's career had instead destroyed his own, revealing him as someone whose jealousy and incompetence had led him to attack one of the most qualified medical professionals the hospital had ever employed. Security officers appeared in the boardroom doorway, ready to escort Henderson from the building with the same efficiency that military operations used to remove personnel who'd proven unfit for duty. His departure was quiet and final, ending months of harassment with the abrupt recognition that his authority had been based on institutional position rather than actual competence or character. Dr. Madison turned his attention to Rose Zhang, his voice carrying the respect that genuine leadership offered to those whose service deserved recognition rather than persecution. "Nurse Martinez, this hospital owes you not just an apology, but a debt of gratitude for your service both in military operations and in your civilian work here. I'd like to discuss how we can better utilize your expertise and ensure that your experience benefits our mission." Rose Jean's response was characteristically modest, but her acceptance suggested that Henderson's departure had finally created an environment where her skills could be properly appreciated and utilized. "I'm here to serve patients, Dr. Madison. That's always been my primary concern." The board meeting concluded with Henderson's disgrace complete and Rose Jean's vindication absolute. But the revelation of her true background would have consequences that extended far beyond Memorial Veterans Hospital. As word of Operation Shepherd's Cross began to spread through military medical communities that had been wondering for years what had happened to the legendary medic whose heroism had become the stuff of classified legend. The quiet nurse who'd endured months of harassment had finally been recognized for who she truly was. But the recognition would come with challenges she'd spent years trying to avoid through deliberate anonymity and careful protection of her privacy. 6 months after Henderson's termination, Memorial Veterans Hospital had transformed into something entirely different. The institutional culture that had allowed systematic harassment of exceptional personnel had been replaced by leadership structures designed to recognize and protect the hospital's most valuable assets. Rose Zhang Martinez no longer worked night shifts in isolation, but had been promoted to Director of Emergency Medical Training, a position created specifically to utilize her extraordinary experience for the benefit of future medical professionals. The Changes began immediately after the board meeting revelation. Within 24 hours, Rose Jean's new role had been approved. Her salary increased to reflect her true qualifications, and her office relocated to the main administrative floor, where her expertise could be properly integrated into hospital operations. But more importantly, the hospital had initiated a comprehensive review of personnel policies to ensure that no qualified professional would ever again face the kind of harassment that had nearly driven away one of the most decorated medics in military history. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the hospital's chief medical officer, had personally overseen Rose Jean's transition to her new position, working closely with her to develop training programs that would benefit not just Memorial Veterans Hospital, but medical professionals throughout the region. The collaboration had revealed the true depth of Rose Jean's expertise, as she shared techniques and protocols that had been developed under the most challenging conditions imaginable. What Rose brings to medical education, Dr. Carter explained to the hospital's expanded board of directors during their first quarterly review since Henderson's termination, goes far beyond standard training programs. She's teaching our staff to think like combat medics, to make rapid decisions under pressure, and to adapt protocols when standard procedures aren't sufficient. The training programs Rose Jean developed drew on her experience from Operation Shepherd's Cross and dozens of other classified missions, extracting medical principles that could save lives in civilian settings while respecting the classification requirements that protected operational details. Her approach emphasized adaptability, resource management, and the kind of calm decision-making that had been forged in environments where mistakes meant death. Young medical residents who attended Rose Jean's training sessions found themselves challenged in ways that traditional medical education had never prepared them for. She created simulation exercises that replicated the stress and resource limitations of battlefield medicine, teaching them to maintain effectiveness when electronic monitoring failed, when standard supplies were unavailable, and when patient loads exceeded normal capacity. Dr. Michael Chang, a second-year resident who'd been skeptical about learning from a nurse until he witnessed Rose Jean's first demonstration, became one of her most enthusiastic advocates. "She teaches us to see medicine the way combat medics see it," he told his fellow residents. "Every decision matters, every second counts, and there's always a way to save someone if you're willing to think beyond standard protocols." The impact of Rose Jean's training extended beyond Memorial Veterans Hospital as word spread through medical communities about the extraordinary resources that had been hiding in their emergency department. Medical schools began requesting guest lectures. Emergency departments asked for consultation on mass casualty protocols, and military medical facilities sought her input on training programs designed to prepare the next generation of combat medics. But the most significant changes weren't institutional, they were personal. The 3 soldiers Rose Jean had rescued from the Minefield had remained in contact with her throughout her civilian career, forming a bond that transcended military service and extended into family relationships. When news of her vindication and promotion reached them, they made a decision that would complete the transformation of her life in ways she'd never anticipated. Master Sergeant David Williams, Sergeant First Class Jennifer Thompson, and Staff Sergeant Daniel Rodriguez had all built successful military careers after their rescue, but they'd never forgotten the debt they owed to the medic who'd carried them through a minefield when their own survival seemed impossible. They'd watched from a distance as Rose Jean quietly rebuilt her life in civilian medicine, respecting her desire for anonymity, while remaining ready to help if she ever needed support. The revelation of her harassment at Memorial Veterans Hospital triggered something in them that went beyond friendship or professional loyalty. Rose Jean had saved their lives under circumstances that most people couldn't imagine, and they weren't going to allow anyone to diminish her achievements or question her character without consequences. Their response was swift and decisive. Within a week of Henderson's termination, All three had submitted requests for transfer to the medical training facility at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where they would help develop a new combat medic training program designed around the principles Rose Zhang had extracted from Operation Shepherd's Cross. The program would be called the Martinez Protocol, honoring the medic whose innovations had kept them alive, and who continued to save lives through her civilian service. Rose Zhang learned about the Martinez Protocol during a secure phone call from Colonel Harrison, who'd been instrumental in documenting her original service record and who now oversaw military medical training development. The news left her speechless, not because she craved recognition, but because she understood that her three rescued teammates were creating a legacy that would extend her impact far beyond anything she could accomplish individually. "Rose," Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine friendship mixed with professional respect, "the Martinez Protocol will train combat medics using the techniques you developed during Operation Shepherd's Cross. Every medic who graduates from this program will carry forward your innovations, potentially saving thousands of lives over the coming decades." The conversation continued with details that made Rose Zhang understand the full scope of what her former teammates were creating. The Martinez Protocol would include navigation techniques for hostile terrain, medical procedures designed for resource-limited environments, and decision-making frameworks that prioritized mission success over personal safety. More importantly, it would emphasize the ethical foundation that had driven Rose Zhang's service, the understanding that medical professionals had obligations that transcended personal survival. "There's something else," Colonel Harrison added, his voice growing more serious. "The three soldiers you rescued want to meet with you, officially this time, to present something that's been waiting for approval since Operation Shepherd's Cross ended." Rose Zhang's breath caught as she realized what Harrison was suggesting. The Medal of Honor recommendation that had been buried for security reasons was finally being processed, not because classification requirements had changed, but because her teammates had spent years working through military bureaucracy to ensure she received the recognition she'd always deserved. The presentation ceremony took place 2 months later at Memorial Veterans Hospital, transforming the same boardroom where Henderson had tried to destroy Rose Zhang's career into a space where genuine heroism was finally acknowledged. The ceremony was small and private, respecting Rose Zhang's desire to avoid media attention while ensuring that her colleagues and supervisors understood the true significance of her service. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer responsible for military medical operations in the Southeast region, personally presented the Medal of Honor with a citation that had been carefully written to acknowledge Rose Zhang's heroism while protecting the operational details that remained classified. The three soldiers she'd rescued stood beside her as the medal was placed around her neck, their presence completing a circle that had been broken by years of separation and secrecy. "This medal represents not just individual heroism," General Hayes said to the assembled hospital staff, "but the kind of service that defines the best traditions of military medicine. Rose Zhang Martinez exemplifies everything we hope to achieve in medical professionals, combining technical excellence with moral courage and selfless dedication to preserving life." The ceremony concluded with Rose Zhang's characteristic modesty, as she deflected attention from her individual achievements and focused instead on the collaborative nature of medical service. "This medal belongs to everyone who's ever chosen to serve others despite personal risk," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had sustained her through months of harassment and years of carrying classified memories. But the medal was only the beginning of changes that would extend Rose Zhang's impact far beyond Memorial Veterans Hospital. The Martinez Protocol became the foundation for a new generation of combat medic training, with graduates deployed to medical facilities throughout the world, where they implemented techniques that had been proven effective under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Dr. Thompson, whose investigation had triggered Rose Zhang's vindication, became her closest collaborator in developing training programs that bridged military and civilian medical practice. Their partnership created innovative approaches to emergency medicine that emphasized adaptability, resourcefulness, and the kind of calm competence that could make the difference between life and death when standard procedures weren't sufficient. What Rose has taught us, Dr. Thompson explained to a conference of emergency medicine professionals, is that the principles of combat medicine aren't just relevant to military settings. They're essential for any medical professional who might face situations where lives depend on their ability to adapt, improvise, and maintain effectiveness despite challenging circumstances. The conference presentation was one of dozens that Rose Zhang delivered over the following year, sharing her expertise with medical professionals throughout the country while maintaining the privacy that had always been important to her. She spoke at military medical facilities, civilian hospitals, medical schools, and emergency response training centers, always emphasizing practical applications rather than personal heroics. Young medical students who attended her lectures found themselves inspired not just by her technical expertise, but by her approach to medical service as a calling that transcended personal advancement or recognition. She taught them to see medicine as a form of service that required moral courage as well as technical competence, and to understand that the greatest victories in medical practice were often invisible to everyone, except the patients whose lives were saved. 1 year after Henderson's termination, Memorial Veterans Hospital hosted its first annual Martinez Symposium on Emergency Medical Excellence, bringing together medical professionals from around the world to share innovations in trauma care, mass casualty response, and medical service under challenging conditions. The symposium became an international forum for advancing medical practice while honoring the principles of service that Rose Zhang had exemplified throughout her career. The symposium's keynote address was delivered by Dr. Robert Madison, the hospital CEO who'd witnessed Rose Zhang's vindication and had overseen the institutional changes that followed. His speech focused on the importance of recognizing and protecting exceptional personnel and the devastating consequences that could result when institutional politics were allowed to override medical excellence. Rose Zhang Martinez taught us that heroism often wears the quiet face of competence, Dr. Madison told the international audience. She showed us that the most valuable professionals are sometimes those who seek no recognition for their service, and that our responsibility as leaders is to create environments where such people can thrive rather than merely survive. As Dr. Madison spoke, Rose Zhang sat in the audience wearing her dress uniform for the first time since leaving military service, the Medal of Honor clearly visible among her ribbons. The 3 soldiers she'd rescued sat beside her, their own decorations reflecting careers that had been built on the foundation of survival she'd made possible years earlier in a minefield half a world away. The pendant she'd worn for so many years now rested in a place of honor in her office, its 3 crosses representing not just the soldiers she'd rescued, but the principles that had guided her service in both military and civilian settings. In its place, she wore the Medal of Honor, not as a symbol of personal achievement, but as a reminder of the obligations that came with exceptional capability and the responsibility to use her skills in service of others. The symposium concluded with the announcement of the Martinez Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to advancing emergency medical training and supporting healthcare professionals who served in challenging environments. The foundation would fund scholarships for combat medic training, support research into emergency medical protocols, and provide assistance to medical professionals transitioning from military to civilian service. Rose Zhang's response to the foundation announcement reflected the same modesty that had characterized her entire career, as she redirected attention from her individual achievements to the collaborative nature of medical advancement. This foundation represents everyone who's ever chosen to serve others despite personal cost, she said. It honors not just those who've been recognized for their service, but those who continue to serve quietly, competently, and without expectation of reward. As the symposium ended and participants returned to their respective institutions around the world, they carried with them not just new medical techniques and protocols, but a renewed understanding of what it meant to serve others with excellence, integrity, and quiet courage. Rose Jean Martinez had become more than just an exceptional medical professional. She'd become a symbol of the values that define the best traditions of healthcare service. The transformation was complete. The quiet nurse who'd once been mocked and harassed for her competence had become an internationally recognized leader whose influence would extend through generations of medical professionals. But perhaps most importantly, she'd proven that genuine heroism didn't require recognition or acclaim, only the courage to serve others regardless of personal cost, and the wisdom to transform individual experiences into benefits that would extend far beyond any single life or career. In her office at Memorial Veterans Hospital, surrounded by letters from medical professionals whose careers had been influenced by her training and from patients whose lives had been saved by techniques she'd developed, Rose Jean Martinez continued the work that had always defined her purpose. She served others with quiet competence, carrying forward the mission that had begun in a minefield years ago and would continue as long as there were lives to be saved and people willing to serve something greater than themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.